installment of our fall seminar series. And I'd like to introduce Will Raap. He comes to us from many different directions, and he's, in contrast to some of our previous speakers, he's a practitioner in a lot of worlds that are of interest to us. And he's going to talk to us a bit about his work in both food systems and renewable energy. But I wanted to just briefly give you a snapshot of the really varied career that Will has had. So he's probably best known for being the founder of Gardner Supply Company, which still exists and located here in Burlington, and also the founder of Intervale, which those of you who don't know the Intervale should certainly check it out. It's a wonderful resource and place to visit here in Burlington. His work extends beyond the food world, though. He is involved in a number of different engagements in the business and conservation development side of things in Costa Rica, and is now actually an active member and co-chair of the board of directors for the new Economics Institute, which I'm excited to hear about. If there's any cool environmental group that you think you want to be involved with in Vermont, Will has probably been involved with it before you, and he's probably been on the board. So he's had his touch in a lot of places, including this school. He's on the board of advisors for the Rubenstein School, so we thank him for that service. So welcome, Will.
Thank you, Christopher. Yeah. So my wife actually thinks I'm most famous for being her husband. I think that's probably, in the long term, a better place to focus for me. So I want to try to take you through a process that I've been going on for 30 years, which really started with recognizing in graduate school that if we don't get our economy right, most of the other things we care about are not going to become right either. And I actually, for a couple of moments, was in a PhD program in economics and then realized I couldn't do the math and actually didn't want to focus in the academic side of things. But what I do want to do is start with the idea of what is economics, or what is an economic system. And I notice there's many people who have taught or teach in the economics program, at least the GUND program here today. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time focusing on that. But the background I want to give you is in relationship to part of this journey I want to take you on. So, and I did what all good students do. I went to Wikipedia to figure out what economics is. And it says this: an economy or economic system consists of the production, distribution, or trade and consumption of limited goods and services by different agents in a given geographical location. That geographical location could be a city, Burlington, which is what I spent time working on, or a state, Vermont, which is what I now spend time working on. The economic agents are businesses and organizations and entities that try and find ways to allocate scarce resources through price systems to get to a transaction. In the past, it says, in the past, economic activity was theorized to be bounded by land or natural resources, labor, and capital, right? And then they go on to say, this view ignores the value of technology and creativity, which we recognize now are enhancements to the ability to operate outside of those boundaries of land, labor, and capital. A given economy is the result of a set of processes that involves its culture, values, education, educational, technological evolution, history, social organization, political structure, and legal systems, as well as its geography, natural resource endowment, and ecology. These are all factors which sort of help us understand how an economic system works. The beauty of that is what they're really saying, it's sort of a political or sociological expression, this idea of an economy, where we have agreements and we have policies and we have contracts and we have relationships that create the structure for what our economic system is. It goes on to say these factors give context, content, and set the conditions and parameters in which an economy functions. Some cultures create more productive economies and function better than others, creating higher value or GDP. So from a GUND point of view, we might say, wait, that's not how you create higher value, although that's really what as we all know, the single measurement is. And I want to talk a little bit about how GPI, which is happening partly through the efforts of the Gund Institute, being injected into the political system in Vermont, might take us in a better and different direction. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about today is this whole idea of boundaries. So, is everyone familiar with the Stockholm Center for Resilience and their Planetary Boundaries research work? A few. Oh, I really encourage you to take a closer look at this. This is essentially a very comprehensive analysis of what some of the natural boundaries are that we should pay attention to in our understanding of the effort to create a balance between economy and ecology, if you will. In this particular scenario, what you see here is 8 different biophysical boundaries that we have to try and figure out how the Earth's ecological system can operate within as the human system pushes those thresholds. So, for example, biodiversity loss, the loss of biodiversity in terms of something that's way out of balance with the Earth's ability to manage that loss and still stay sustainable is way out of bounds. It would be way over here somewhere in terms of the biodiversity loss issue. Nitrogen cycle, the same thing. Partly through our energy system and our agriculture system, we have an excess of nitrogen in our biological or in our biophysical system, which we aren't able to manage and absorb within the planetary boundaries. Then you have climate change. We're out of sync, as you can see already. We know that because we've passed 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. Land use, we're getting close to the outer boundaries of our use of land being in excess with our capacity to sustain that use of land. Same with ocean acidification, freshwater use, ozone depletion, phosphorus cycle, etc. So this idea of resilience is, and our economic system surpassing the limits that we can quantify scientifically in some of these key boundary areas is something that's not embedded in our economic process and thinking. As you know, climate change, we haven't figured out really how to internalize the cost and damage and risk associated with climate change. So, I'm sorry, this is going to be sort of quick and dirty, but it's I tried to figure out how over 30 years I've been involved in a range of what I'll call areas of opportunity to impact this balance between ecology and economics. And what I call these spheres around these areas of opportunity or sectors in the economy is enterprise ecologies. And my goal with those has been, I didn't start from this point of view because we didn't have some of these words back then, but my goal is how do we create what I'll call local living economies. And if you know the Bali organization, Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, they sort of create this notion that we could relocalize parts of our economy to good outcomes. And all of those good outcomes might in fact lead us to a new economy. So this idea of the biophysical limits, global warming, climate change, and peak everything, all the resource areas or capacity to absorb the residual impacts of the human economy are essentially adding up to probably require some kind of a instigation of a new economic output or outcome that's different than our current economy, different than those policies, contracts, agreements, relationships that now are so stuck in place. So I'll start with the food system. Because that's essentially where I got to Vermont and got involved with the gardening business, created Gardener's Supply, created a business that says we want to create innovative gardening products. We want to partner with our customers so they're successful, and we want to have an impact on the world. This was in the early 80s when sort of the Ben and Jerry's push to socially responsible business was just emerging in Vermont before Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility was created. But it was all of us who started businesses sort of with a mission drive to it in the late 70s, early 80s, were contributors to this outcome. I started in a two-car garage in Burlington. I moved to a 6-car garage in Winooski, and ultimately we moved across the river to the Burlington Intervale. Everyone know the Burlington Intervale, more or less? Okay. So you can see it's a fairly large piece of land in relationship to the rest of Burlington. The important thing here is that it is Burlington, an economic hub for the state, and that we did have, at that point, Bernie Sanders and Peter Clavell, political leadership that said, hey, this idea of sustainability is important. So when we went to them and said, there's a mess in the Intervale, hundreds of cars, dumps that were essentially put on the wrong side of the tracks here in Burlington. And when we got there, all of the city's sludge from their sewage treatment plants were essentially injected into the Intervale to be dispersed, mostly probably into the lake by virtue of the high water table. And we said, isn't there a better way to approach this? And so we gave Bernie Sanders, mayor at that point, some choices about what we might do. One of them was we could capture the waste heat out of the McNeil plant and grow something in greenhouses. Another is we could start a market garden to support the food system in Burlington. And the third is, which is the one he said, go do that one, is we could collect all the yard waste and compost it. And so that's what we did for 20-some years, creating the largest composting program in Vermont since taken over by the Chittenden County Solid Waste District. But one of the things we did by starting from this point of there's a diminished ecological health of the Intervale, because for 50 years it was chemical corn that was farmed there, we essentially began with the increasing of the fertility of that soil using a waste stream, which is, whenever you can figure out how to do that, that's a good outcome. But there's another thing we did in terms of this as it relates to climate change. Any idea what that is? Half. Part of what happens when all this organic matter from yard waste goes into landfills is it sort of gurgles there, and methane and other greenhouse gases are emitted as opposed to get stabilized. So you make compost, you stabilize it, but you also begin to create, when you put it back in the soil, we went from 1% organic matter to 4 to 5% organic matter in the Intervale by taking all this yard waste and putting it into a productive use. And I'll anchor that idea for a second because I want to get back to it. But this idea of carbon sequestration is part of the solution to global warming that most people don't talk about, and I wish it was talked about more. And it's one of the areas that I think the University of Vermont could really play some leadership roles in. We then did the second thing we talked to Bernie about. We started the First Csa in Vermont, which is the Intervale Community Farm, still operating, the largest CSA in Vermont. And that precipitated an incubation program for now a dozen farms in the Intervale. So these are all farmers who farm down in the Intervale in sort of a collaborative program of sharing resources and being incubated, some of whom stay there a long period of time, some of whom get their markets going, get their farming expertise going, and then move out of the Intervale. So now the Intervale is a place which is like a little business ecology with a dozen farms and food processing and nurseries. Compost project has moved out, but other kind of businesses are moving in. And it also has become sort of a hub of education for people who don't know where their food comes from but can learn, for people who just want to have a festival experience, for people who want recreation opportunities. the innovation continues. So this idea of a multi-farm CSA is being expressed now by the Intervale Food Hub, where there are 25 to 30 farms who aggregate their produce, and they then make a commitment to sell a certain percentage of that through the Intervale Food Hub. Intervale Food Hub then sells to, some of you might be members, sells to students at UVM, sells to businesses so they can deliver them to where those businesses are. Because the idea of taking a food system and making it stronger and stronger is partly about building the relationships such that the people who are going to commit to buying food and jump through the hoops. When we first started the Intervale Community Farm, you had to work 10 hours a month as a volunteer. That was good for 1% of the population. When we wanted to get to 10 and 20 and 30% of the population, we had to make it more convenient. So now this program allows us to actually deliver where people, they want this fresh produce, they don't want to go through some of the same sort of hoops that the early adopters were willing to do. That then led to, directly actually, I became the co-chair of a Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility committee because VBSR was getting requests from their members to say, help us who are in the food system get this food economy going better. So they said, we don't know what that means, let's try and understand that. So VBSR joined with rural Vermont to sort of initiate what became legislation to create the Farm to Plate program. Farm to Plate program, familiar with? So Farm to Plate uses a system change methodology to figure out how to, in a sense, set a mission. The mission is, can we double the amount of food dollars that stay in Vermont? So it's already a lot relative to the rest of the country. Can we double that? How do you think about double that? You got to really understand all the components of the system and then start building stakeholder engagement with that system to bring them in. Other outcomes, we want stronger businesses and better jobs. We want greater access to healthy food for all Vermonters. So today is Food Day. Does anyone know about Food Day? So last week was World Food Day. How does that relate to today as Food Day? Do you know? I don't. U.S. Food Day. Is that correct? So World Food Day is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and this is sort of a connection to, the U.S. Food Day is connected to that in some way?
I don't know that they're directly connected.
Okay. Well, they're in the same month, right? But anyway, this idea, so I was part of a presentation last week on World Food Day, which had to do with hunger and food insecurity. So in Vermont, there is 13% of the population is hungry or food insecure. It was 22,000 people a decade ago. It's 33,000 people today. It's part of an overall food system that is failing us in many ways. We think we're doing so well in Vermont. We're not, in the sense of hunger and food security. So this is a very important goal. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm looking at the food system economy. Seems like the labor supply in here, because of the current issues around, where the workers are coming from, or is that not in there?
I'll speak to that in just a second.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. This is really sort of, in the economic system, the major forces, right? Consumer demand, retail distribution, wholesale distribution. So that would be a constraint. Do we have the soil? Do we have the nutrients? Do we have the labor to do that? And that's part of this. One of the things that Farm to Plate did is they create these what do they call them? Cross-cutting.
There's cross-cutting teams?
Yes, the cross-cutting.
Working groups.
So there's a cross-cutting team, I believe, for labor availability. Is there not?
I don't know.
Okay, so I'll tell you what they are. These are what are called from a systems change standpoint. These are the leverage points, right? That Farm to Plate has identified we must get people focused on and integrated around. Food insecurity, which I talked about. Second, workforce development. That's your labor piece. Third, technical assistance and business planning. Can we create stronger businesses that can thrive as the food system changes? Third, or fourth is energy. And then the last three, remember, capital mobilization, regulation, education, communication, coordination across the food system. Remember that because those three are three of the four leverage points that also exist in a similar system change process that's happening within the energy system in Vermont. Does that make sense? We'll get to there in just a second. So the energy system. I've been much more involved with the food system. In the energy system, my aha came when, this is Gardner's Supply. Those are the steam towers at the McNeil plant. So when I moved Gardner's Supply to the Intervale, that was the largest bioenergy electrical generating plant in the country. And I think it's third or fourth right now. But it's still essentially replacing fossil fuel imports with things we can produce in Vermont, trees, to produce a percentage of the energy. Some of it's natural gas, most of it's biomass though. But up the stacks went a lot of the waste heat. Now there have been plans over time to plug into Burlington with a district heating concept. So not only could we generate electricity, we could also generate steam, which we'd ship up to UVM and we'd ship up to downtown. That still, I bet, is going to happen at some point with that plant there. But I got interested in actually developing a 4-acre eco park with greenhouses and food processing that was going to be using the waste heat out of the McNeil plant to heat the greenhouses. This is a permitted project, but politics, but the economy got in the way. What really got in the way? Politics, funding from Washington, D.C., resistance from city government. Again, this is sort of the economy, the economic constructs around which things happen or don't happen in the economy. Now, I believe that waste heat is still going to be used in the Intervale, maybe in something like this, but before that, I believe there's going to be a couple acres of greenhouses down the way at Intervale Community Farm, which can plug into not high-quality steam heat, but warm water heat as an expression. So in the next couple of years, we'll hopefully see that. But just as Montpelier just established a biomass district heating program that the economics make a whole lot of sense around, as well as climate change mitigation questions, we're going to see that same possibility, I think, in Burlington coming up, knock on wood. Okay, so as the Intervale Food Hub began to look at how do we bring in the next quartile of not passionate, committed, dedicated people into a food system, I began to ask that same question more broadly outside of the Intervale. And so 10 years ago, I got involved with, does anyone know where South Village is on Spear Street? So South Village was actually owned by a woman, Rena Calkins, who owned most of the land in the Intervale. She's since died. But I hooked her family up with a developer who had an idea for what's called conservation development. Conservation development concept is, can we take a piece of land and develop it in such a way that we're actually conserving more than we're depleting? So in the sense of South Village, 70%, this is a 220-acre parcel, 70% of that land is left open. The wetland complex here and the habitat complex here actually has to be improved under the Act 250 regulations. A farm gets installed here such that when 330 households ultimately live there, they might actually be able to move in and have their food and also their energy. So this was actually the signing of the 2011 Renewable Energy Bill in Vermont at the project that I initiated at South Village, where the goal is that solar energy production can feed into about 30 homes in South Village, as well as support the farm. But you begin to get this connection with that around land use that includes food issues and energy issues, and in the case of South Village, water. So 3 of the key threshold issues in how to create a sustainable economy, food, energy, water, are being addressed partly here. How they address water is all the water is retained on site, and they're essentially using that goal to create healthier wetlands and habitat ponds and that sort of thing. So as Sophie knows, who I work with in South Burlington, we're trying to change the suburban design protocols to support this idea of these common zones of that land. So we're looking at a system of business development, economic development opportunity that also results in land restoration outcomes. So I'll go from that microcosm to a macrocosm. What percent of the excess carbon emissions in the atmosphere come from land use, that is deforestation, degradation, etc.? Any idea? 30? It's closer to 50. And the food system itself, if you take into account the industrial food system, which is very energy intensive, and the fertilizers required, and the equipment required, and the transportation, the refrigeration, and the processing, is about 30% of the current emissions in our economy. Now, we don't look at the food system as a sector to evaluate greenhouse gas emissions, right? We look at transportation, we look at electrical use for refrigeration, etc. But if you aggregated the food system, it's about 30% of our overall current greenhouse gas emissions. And the excess gas emissions in the atmosphere is about 50%, represents over three centuries what we've done in terms of impacting, degrading the land, therefore releasing carbon, whether it's from the soil or trees you burn or whatever. So this chart I love because it basically talks about in healthy ecosystems where carbon is stored, below ground and above ground, right? So we think of a forest as a really important storage unit for carbon, which it is above ground. It's pretty good below ground too, but it's nothing compared to a wetland or compared to a peatland. So as coming out of the European carbon trading scheme, there was the Chicago Climate Exchange that was emerging here in the US. So I got involved with a group of people who said, let's try to advance carbon sequestration on a grand scale, on a big scale. It's not easy to do. Particularly it's not easy to do without a market for that carbon. We thought there was going to be a market for the carbon. This is a tropical forest, and this is the Palouse area of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana. 7 million acres of mostly grain production now. We went to 10 areas around the world looking at how to create a carbon accounting methodology. So when there were carbon markets, you could look at putting insulation in attics, or reducing emissions from a cement factory, or putting more energy efficient vehicles on the road. Each of those had a potential carbon impact, and they were monetizing that. How did they do that? They did that by having a baseline. Here's this building without insulation, and here's the amount of emissions. We put insulation in, we reduce the emissions, we can measure that emission reduction, therefore we can measure the value of it, therefore we can monetize that carbon reduction. And so we said, can we do that same thing with ecosystems more broadly? Now there was the forest protocol, and RED, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, that was happening in that time frame, where there were carbon sequestration methodologies that were moving through the various carbon markets and mechanisms to evaluate carbon reduction. But there was no sort of comprehensive protocol. So we spent 3 years creating a comprehensive protocol, good for wetlands and forests and peatlands and prairies and sort of all ecosystems, and we tested that in 10 ecosystems around the world. And that protocol last year was just approved by VCS. VCS is the voluntary carbon, it was the voluntary carbon standard. It's now called the verified carbon standard. And it's sort of that mechanism that looks at getting carbon accounting methodologies approved. So we got that approved. There's still no carbon market, right? But we got that approved under the possibility that in the future there would be a carbon market. Now, we're also working towards getting that protocol embedded in the California Climate Action Registry process, which is probably the thing that's going to get the most traction in the US. So I'll just take a minute talking about, because this is an interesting adventure. We got that. One of the trends was getting, or one of the threads was getting that protocol permitted through these various global climate management mechanisms. But then we also wanted to figure out, is there a business here? Because the only way this is going to scale is if you can actually have the possibility to create a business that is going to attract capital, invest, and the more capital that's invested, the more land that gets restored, if you can find an ROI model on that, right? So the first thing we did is we hooked up with the largest proposed wind farm in the US in New Mexico, 5 gigawatts. And they were going to essentially put in hundreds of miles of roads and hundreds of pads for big wind farms, et cetera. And our business, and this business is made up of 2 entities that had the capacity to deliver on this. One is the largest reforestation company in Canada and Central America, called Brinkman Forestry, and the other is called Applied Ecological Services, which is the largest sort of environmental restoration consulting company in the US. So those 2, but they also recognized they were going to have a destruction happening to their grazing land. So our job was to go in and figure out how to restore that grazing land, which we were working on doing, as we also looked at doing that such that we could create a baseline and then do the restoration so that carbon could accrue, and if there were markets, they would have additional income. They were attracted because it was sort of like, sure, fix my land too, even though it's going to probably be wrecked from the windmills that go in, wind farms that go in, and if you can do that, that would be a bonus. We learned an amazing lesson: how to aggregate independent-minded landowners under an ecological principle or point of view. Now, we still don't have carbon markets, and that wind farm is sort of stuck in permitting processes still. But what it led us to is the discovery that on this land, you've got a range of invasive species, because as the cattle grazed it, they degraded the quality of the land, and you had these vectors coming in for mesquite and juniper and other things growing, which then further diminished the health of the land. So part of our restoration strategy was picking these invasives, chipping them, and trying to find a market to buy it. Okay. So no carbon market. Good idea about creating chips that someone might want to buy, but there was no one who wanted to buy those chips. And so we we just continued the process, but this idea of aggregating landowners who normally don't work together on a large scale, figuring out how to do that, communications, contracts, all that sort of stuff, and then working with invasives to take those invasives off to improve the land was something we recognized was a core competitive advantage we had. So we then recognized at this point in Europe there was a new requirement for coal plants to move from to move away from coal and replace some of that with biomass. Because if you can replace coal with biomass, they were meeting some of their emissions goals. So all of a sudden, we got created a whole new market opportunity for hundreds of millions of tons of biomass. So what happens? You start cutting down the forest in British Columbia, in Georgia, in places like this, where there was the demand for that biomass. Our biomass is different. Our biomass is restorative. When you take this biomass out, you improve the quality of the land. So we can actually sell biomass that has a positive conservation or land use impact to it. Because if you take these invasives off and then replant with natives, you get a flourishing of that carbon, again, in this case, in a dry prairie ecosystem. So that's where we are. And we just got $2 million investment to go to the next level, and a $30 million investment to then do the chip plant. But what we learned in the New Mexico failure was how to aggregate these landowners, in this case in Texas and Louisiana, to do this capture and harvesting of invasive species. So we haven't made our first dollar yet, but at least there's a path forward. And the carbon methodology is still in place. So we have determined what the baseline is on these ecosystems, and we can look at a protocol that if and when there's a carbon market, there could be a residual value of income from that to be determined. So that then gets to this last point about this whole idea of having impact in the food system and the energy system and improvements in the biosphere. There are ways to build nonprofits and for-profits around those things. And ultimately, I think they're beginning to add up to the creation of the possibility of a new economy being created. It will not happen globally. It will not happen nationally. It can happen in Vermont, my opinion. GPI is a part of that process. It's a genuine progress indicator where we embed GPI thinking. That is, it's not just about growth, it's about 26. It's about 26 different factors that look at creating prosperity across all dimensions of capital, human, natural, built, etc. But the progress we're making in the food system and in the energy system and in the working landscape system are in fact creating new economy by virtue of different kinds of contractual relationships, agreements, and policies that build in the possibility of sustainability. And our job, in a sense now, is to take that kind of systems thinking that we've done for food and energy and apply it to the economy more largely. So that's what I spend a fair amount of my time on now. how to collect those stakeholders that are already working on some of these things, but then could come together to move the whole economic system in Vermont to a new place. And frankly, we were successful in the city of Burlington. We didn't define it as that, but a lot of the work related to job force development, food system development, energy efficiency, et cetera, in Burlington have proved important in creating a stronger economy here. So the last thing I'll throw at you is I love to look at the McKinsey Consulting Company because they try to make complicated things simple. And they had a report come out recently called Resource Revolution, Meeting the World's Energy, Materials, Food, and Water Needs. And what this says is, these are dollars. These are dollars of opportunity leading up to about $3 trillion of opportunity to improve our resource efficiency across, in this case, 15 different categories. And there's a whole bunch of more categories we didn't define it specifically. And this is sort of the return on investment. So if it's less than 1, a dollar spent gives you more than a dollar back. So your ROI is positive. So this is the only negative of that, which is electric and hybrid vehicles, which could all change, right, because of technology and different things. But the thing I wanted to point your attention to on this, going back to food system, is large-scale farm yields, a $266 billion opportunity by investing in the right things with a positive return on investment versus smallholder farm yields, $143 billion opportunity with the same sort of return on investment metrics. Does that make sense to you? Does the idea that we could, in terms of the advancement of our resource base to produce food is the industrial model is almost twice as good in terms of total dollars as the smallholder or small scale model. So let me give you a number, 2 numbers. We invest 70%, in terms of agriculture globally, we invest 70% of our resources in industrial agriculture to produce 30% of our food. In smallholder, diversified agriculture, we invest 30% of our resources to produce 70% of our food. Is that familiar? That's not known information. So essentially what it seems to me we have going on here is the overinvestment in industrial agriculture, and even people as smart as McKinsey don't look at the possibility that our investment return is much greater in the kind of agriculture we have in Vermont. Right? So part of the challenge we have is to make the policies and the frameworks of our economic system shift away from overinvestment in industrial agriculture to investment in diversified agriculture. And when you do that, you also get the co-benefits of creating a healthier ecosystem because you typically have more diversified crops. You have more places like the Intervale where they're building soil, where you're looking at the balance of habitat with production, etc. My key lesson's over 30 years. Well, I have it, so I'll talk about it for a second. The whole idea of food, energy, and more recently a focus on capital comes from a report that happened in Burlington called the Leaky Bucket Report about how do we strengthen our economy by plugging the leaks in the economy. And it said basically food, energy, and capital were the major leaks. Then this next piece about employing leverage points really has everything to do with this system change thinking. And the last thing I'll talk about for a second is this idea of we just don't have an economic system that acknowledges, recognizes, and values the impact we have on the biosphere in such a way that we're beginning to make investment decisions that give us the best return on that investment, as the McKinsey report sort of began to talk about, although misses the point as it relates to agriculture. Okay. So, any questions, comments?